This declaration is not about sovereignty. We are sovereign countries who have the capacity to act as we choose to act.
I know some people don't like it. It's a loss of national sovereignty, but it is a simple reality. It is a simple reality.
The question that faces us is to make sure we act in a sovereign way that serves Canada's interests.
That's Prime Minister Stephen Harper at a press conference with the U.S. President Barack Obama just minutes ago in Washington. Now, the Prime Minister said that the declaration to go ahead with negotiations for a continental security perimeter is aimed at streamlining security to improve the flow of goods and people across the border. But there's a lot of questions about this deal. We don't really know a lot of the details. Does the deal mean a threat to national sovereignty? Or is it essential to keep trade flowing between Canada and the United States? So there's lots to cover here. We've got a whole crew standing by to talk about this. And Minister Cannon, by the way, Lawrence Cannon, will come to Power and Politics. He's literally on a plane right now from Washington. He's coming back here to Ottawa. He'll come directly here to Power and Politics to give us the details, not only of what they discussed on the trade issues, of course, but on the unfolding situation in Egypt. And we've got that covered as David Common is standing by. And one last thing I want to get to before I get to this discussion of the trade. There's a lot of news that has broken in the last 30 minutes here. The Supreme Court of Canada has now overturned the the government's overturning of the CRTC decision on Global Live. This is allowing competition in the mobile phone sector. And we're going to get the CEO of Wind, we've just learned, Ken Campbell. He'll be here as well to give us his initial reaction to that. It's just the federal court on that. So this is just happening. This has real implications here on competition in terms of cell phone. But let me get into this deal here. Joining me now is the Liberal House Leader, David McGuinty. He's here along with the NDP Foreign Affairs critic, Paul Dewar. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Hi there.
We don't know a lot of a lot of the details about exactly what they agreed to, but just your initial reaction first, David, and then Paul. Your initial reaction on Prime Minister Harper. He says this is not a question of sovereignty. It will increase trade with our biggest trading partner.
He's wrong. It's both. It's obviously a question of trade. It's a question of perimeter security, and it's a question of sovereignty here, Evan. For a Prime Minister who has denied for the last several weeks that there was even a deal in the works, any Canadian can go to his website and see at least 5 or 6 or even up to 8 background papers talking about the sovereignty and other implications around the issues that are being treated here in this deal. So he's wrong. And the problem here is this is the kind of discussion and debate that we could have and should have and must have in the House of Commons, whether it's in the House, whether it's in the standing committee. But this is something that we have to look at very closely, Evan, because the future of the country is at stake.
What was your initial reaction? Again, just so folks know, and I'll show you the hot sheet, we've got some details, but let me get your initial reaction. I'll go over some of the details.
Well, Evan, you know, the concern is about process, of course. We need input from Canadians and oversight from Parliament. But what's of concern is that you have words like ambitious. This is large from the Prime Minister. This is about not just the movement of goods, but also people. And what does that mean in terms of privacy of Canadians? What does it mean in terms of our natural resources? We're talking about general comments about energy. We're going to be shipping raw bitumen south, unrefined. That means jobs. It also means impact on the environment. And we're supposed to just trust this Prime Minister. Well, excuse me if we don't just trust this Prime Minister. And finally, who gets input? I noted that, the chief executives of Canada had input. They had an exclusive meeting with government officials. Why isn't Canadians, everyday people, get to discuss these issues? Why is it only the chosen, they lay hands on certain people, get to have input? I think that's wrong. So the process is really flawed.
I'll put that, by the way, to John Manley. He did get a sneak peek at this in a briefing earlier today. A former Deputy Prime Minister, former Finance Minister, but also now the head of the Council for Chief Executives.
And not Canadians or Parliament.
Let me just show our viewers some of the details that we do know from this. Here's some of the key points on the U.S.-Canada vision for this so-called perimeter security. Addressing threats early, trade facilitation with an emphasis on economic growth and jobs, integrated cross-border law enforcement, critical infrastructure, and cyber security. Now, again, David McGuinty, the Prime Minister said in some of his remarks, this declaration is only a starting point. Borders can distinguish people, that they must not separate them. This is a declaration on a relationship, but he did stress that it was not a question of sovereignty. But sovereign trade deals are always a question of both. Isn't that fair that he's simply saying that, you know, this is our closest export partner, this is our closest partner. We have to integrate on this to expedite goods and services. And we're making choices on that.
Well, you've just run a whole series of issues that ought to be dealt with, or apparently are being dealt with, Evan. When Canadians see this list, they're going to say that this speaks entirely to our sovereignty going forward. To what extent are we going to harmonize our regulations on greenhouse gases, on water standards, on, you know, this could affect everything from the cereal content to the way we sell our bread, the way we make our products, the way we export our products. This is a fundamental question of sovereignty here, whether or not, as a sovereign country, we have the right to abide by our own regulations. For example, on the energy question that you alluded to, that Paul's alluded to, did the Prime Minister go to Washington today, cap in hand, and say, we know there's a dysfunctional Congress right now on the energy and environment issue on greenhouse gases, but did he actually make overtures on behalf of Canada and bring a sovereign viewpoint on greenhouse gas reductions or putting a price on carbon emissions? Did he raise that as a sovereign Prime Minister, or did he go there cap in hand? You know,
Let me show you what he said. I'll give and
Please
do
do.
that.
Sure.
Here, you know, this is what the Prime Minister did say about energy, touting that we are the biggest exporters of fossil fuels to the U.S. Here's what he actually said about that.
The choice that the United States faces in all of these matters is whether to increase its capacity to accept such energy from the most secure, most stable, and friendliest location it can possibly get that energy, which is Canada, or from other places that are not as secure, stable, or friendly.
Clearly a reference to Saudi Arabia, which is the second largest exporter of oil to the U.S.
Well, first of all, that's not the only choice the United States has. It's a bit presumptuous for the Prime Minister of Canada to tell the United States what their choice is. The reality is, I think what's interesting here, what's contradistinction here, is what Obama said just a couple of weeks ago in the State of the Union when he said, you know, folks, we're getting off fossil fuels. We're moving to an energy efficiency revolution. We're in the race. We're going to move aggressively into renewables. And our Prime Minister didn't, I don't think, speak about the renewable superpower capacity of Canada. He went down instead tried to secure, in fact, he sounded, to be frank with you, a bit of a shill. He was a shill for the oil industry down in Washington, and we can do better than that.
I know you want to comment on that, but also comment, because both of you, Deputy Leader and also, or House Leader rather, and also a Foreign Affairs critic, this is clearly also alluding to the situation in the Middle East, and they were both asked about Egypt. You know, the U.S. has said that this transition has to happen now. Did you notice any light between the Prime Minister and Obama on the unfolding situation in Egypt?
Although, you know, it was really interesting to watch, Evan, because I've been very critical, we've been very critical of the government not being declarative and at least being in line with the U.S., with Cameron in the U.K., with France, etc. All he said was, I agree with the President, and then, which I found interesting, he didn't define that. The President was very clear, we need to see a movement and transition from Mubarak to a group of others who have come together in the opposition to then go towards elected government. But then he said something very interesting, Harper. He said that the transition is happening. I have no idea where he got that information. The problem right now is the transition is not happening, and that's a frustration for many of us. It is of President Obama. And so it's either he's not aware of what's going on, he has to clarify what he meant by that when he said the transition is happening, and he still looks offside, notwithstanding his saying, oh, I agree with the President. Of course he did, because of where he was. The comments that have come out of the government have not been in line with our allies, and that's a real problem.
I got 30 seconds just to finish it up, and I got Minister Cannon coming in, David McGuinty, so would you have a question for him?
Yeah, I'd ask him whether or not Canada is going to take on the preeminent role it should be taking globally in being the leading jurisdiction, sovereign jurisdiction, in actually helping to build the rule of law and strengthen democracy and strengthen institutions around the world. Why has Canada not filled that vacuum? Why have we deliberately pulled back, Evan, on that front, when we have so much to offer, the Canadian flag, our rule of law, our democratic traditions? This is a really big opportunity for Canada to lead the way.
Guys, I got to leave it there. David McGuinty, a Liberal House Leader, and Paul Dewar, NDP Foreign Affairs critic. Interesting reaction to that summit today. Really covered two issues, the perimeter issue and, of course, the unfolding situation in Egypt. Interesting.
Thank you.
Interesting comment from these gents here. And again, we'll have Lawrence Cannon. We'll see what he says on that.